on how to do that. And then I'm going to talk briefly about version control. And I'll then give you reference material because there are tons of talks about reference control. So I'm just going to highlight why it's important, why you should be using it in your projects. But there's an associated learning curve. And much about how you organize your computational biology is really personal discipline. Honestly, it's your computer. You can, organize. We all got different mind frames on how we work, how we organize our project. But there are some best practices, and borrowed slides and talks from Nabil Farid, who is a great bioinformatician with Arctic Network and with the Clive infrastructure in the UK. And I thought I'll just go through his talk actually, because he's done a better job at showing and describing those projects. So, a quick guide to organizing computational projects. There is a really nice sort of talk, a publication on how to do this, and highlights your files and how you organize your directory. Working with lab notebooks. This concept of a single experiment, command line processes or instructions versus writing a script, and versus having full-fledged programs and eventually workflows. And there's version control, of course. How do you back up? How do you track what's happening, the modification that you're making on your script, and in a reproducible way and in a tractable way. And often when you're working on most bioinformatics projects, it's about collaborations. How do you work with your colleague? You may have people who are not bioinformaticians, but often you work with a team of bioinformaticians. And how do you keep control of the files that you're working with? So, you need to understand the details of your project, right? How do you organize a particular project? So often, we get to either create a directory in our home environment, and by home here, I'm more or less referring to the Unix or the Linux file system. It's slightly different if you're on Windows. We have the C drive or D drive or whatever drive. I mean, it's the same thing. And within it, different operating systems enforce specific directory structures. Okay, and it's just the way files are stored in a deterministic way, and how sometimes the operating system wants to enforce standards for their users and how to store files. So, you got a standard sort of desktop folder, you got a documents folder, within documents folder, ideally, that's where you store your documents, but there's no definition of what comprises a document. What is a document? Is it something that is editable, or is it a file? And if you're on a Linux Unix system, the concept of a file and directory structure is slightly different, because under Linux Unix, everything is a file. Okay, so whether it's a directory, it may be named or called a directory, but indeed it's a file. Okay, and a file is a file, whether it's executable, non-executable, read-only, non-read-only, and so on and so forth. A process can also be a file. Okay, and a command can still be a file. So under Linux Unix, we got this sort of broad generalization of what comprises a file. That's not the case in Windows, where we got this quite sometimes nice differences, although internally they are still files. If you see what I mean, they're still files. It doesn't matter whether it's a directory or not. Okay, and therefore sometimes you want to organize your top-level directory, and then you want to have directories under it that will do different things. The documentation, you can have where your data are stored. So this will be your primary data. Often will be either sort of primary level data or secondary data, all are linked to a read-only data folder if you're working within a HPC environment, working with tons of data. So for example, if I'm doing a single cell experiment or doing metagenomics, I may have loads and loads of these of reads that are stored somewhere on our storage server. Okay, and we can't all copy those files onto our home directories because we will be misusing storage. The system administrator will not be happy. In some cases, you'll be kicked out of the HPC for simply doing that. Okay. So what you want to do is make use of symbolic links or static links into your data, but then you want to organize so that you know that's where your data lives. And Unix links, like this conversion of SRC, which will be like source. So that's where potentially your editable scripts will be stored. Okay, and bin, I think for binary, that's where your executables will be stored. Okay, so if I got single files that are executables, I will want to store them in here, and the assumption is that I'll run an analysis, I'll get some results, and I'll store my results over here, and I can have a structure. Depending on when I run my analysis, I can use dates to define or rename directories. And this can be automatic depending on how your scripts are running, how results are stored. Okay, or you can just run the results and then make use of version control to name and keep track of your results folder. Okay. So again, within one, you can have multiple subdirectories. And in documentation, for example, here you got analysis.html. Maybe that is where all your analysis is stored, or the scripts, or all the nice documentation telling somebody what's going on in this file or in this project. And then maybe you may have information about papers and so on and so forth. And again, data, you can have subdirectories depending on the complexity of your project. Okay. So there are different ways to do this, but there are sometimes best practices. Okay. But overall, and I really like this diagram from Farid Ali Khan, is that our data cascade through multiple stages. Okay. And going back to like the talk from Charles, quite a broad spectrum work. And therefore, what you tend to see is that you don't have sort of this linear, nice cascade of tasks that you can set from the beginning. Okay, but this will be sort of the nature of your typical bioinformatics process. That assuming it's genomic data, you ingest in your sequence data. There may be existing published data. And there may be experiments that are going to be done to complement your sequence data. And all this is going into some sort of storage working directory that cuts across analysis, pipelines, and visualization. Okay, so analysis, you do your analysis, you get your output, it'll be form of a TSV, maybe an Excel worksheet, all as just a summary report. Okay, in one form or another. And you want to ingest the results of this to a visualization. And sometimes visualizations can be end results by themselves, but often you will reintegrate and modify your analysis depending on the visualization. And over here, it could be any tooling. You could be using R, you could be using Julia, you could be using Python pandas, and all sort of nice graphical things. If you're hardcore, you'll be using tech, and so on and so forth. So you got this idea of the integration, and again, back and forth, this whole feedback is all happening within the lifetime of your project. And this can be 1 day, 2 weeks, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Okay? If you set that experiment really well, you may not have to change a lot of things. Okay? At some point, you'll need to share your results with a collaborator, with a publisher. You will need to share something with your colleagues. You might want to share something with, again, publishers open access. And therefore, you have to think about how you securely transfer data. And at the end of the lifetime of your project, you'll need to archive that project. Okay, and sometimes the open access repositories can be an end themselves; they can act as archives. Often you want to do manual archive, and this also depends on your data management or data access policy in your institute. Okay, and therefore, after some point, maybe X number of years, people will want to reclaim their disk space. Your result is no longer usable, maybe destroy it or remove it from disk. Okay, so you've got to think right from the beginning how you're going to walk through that workflow. Okay. So the key thing that our results should be reproducible from primary data. Okay, so moving right from your primary data and going back to that diagram, you will generate secondary data from your primary data, and you do the visualizations, which are sort of a tertiary data. And then you've got to do the data sharing, manuscript documentation, and so on and so forth. Okay, so at every stage over here, in the lifetime of your project, it's important to know what it is that you're doing and what are the steps that are reproducible. And also, you've got to take in context how much storage you have, so that as you're thinking through your project, you can think about, secondary data and tertiary data. Okay, so often tertiary data is things that you produce either sometimes from secondary data often because of an output of some analysis, but this is always something that you can always delete. Yeah, because if you write a script and write it in a reproducible way, you can always regenerate that as long as you got the tertiary data. And the idea is also that if you got secondary data and you have a really nice backup, sort of a reproducible system, really what you want to keep is just the primary data. Okay, and then you run the analysis, and you can delete that as long as everything is documented nicely and properly. And that's why we're thinking about workflows. Okay, so when you start in your project, and the whole workflow idea, as we'll see tomorrow when you start thinking about SnakeMake, is that you start in by ingesting your primary data, and then you go through a number of steps generating secondary data, and then tertiary data. And all we want to keep is the script or the workflow that allows us to produce this secondary and tertiary data, and the primary data. Okay? And if we can do that, everything becomes really nice and reproducible. Okay? So how do containers fitting into this paradigm? Okay? It's just what I'm talking about. You get your data, you choose whether you want to use a SnakeMake, or we'll see a Nextflow tomorrow, and that becomes your workflow software. And your analysis software, on the other hand, will be managed by these containers, these environments. And we can choose one of either, okay? So you can either choose that your analysis software is nice and done through Coda, or Docker, or Singularity, as we'll highlight. And your analysis workflow pattern will be managed by one of these two. They're not the only ones. Actually, you can say, well, if I'm not interested in these advanced workflows, it's just purely Bash scripts that will ingest those data. Okay, we try to move away from that by saying, you can have all that managed by SnakeMake. Okay, and therefore you'll be able to generate your secondary data, assemblies, genotyping, do your analysis, get your results, and then I'll move on to this one. And here we've been told, pick one, and also pick one of these, right? So often for beginners, people sometimes tend to start from here and here, but as you'll see later on, there's quite good advantages of picking the alternatives. Okay. Yeah, and that sort of concludes that talk about how to manage your data. But I'm happy to hear people say, how they manage their data. What's your workflow like, and does that make sense? Yeah, I think it does make sense for me. Thinking largely about how you manage your data in that sort of approach. Yes, please. Yeah. Yeah, good one. So best practice is a big one, because if you choose, for example, Docker, it can do everything that Coda can do, and sometimes Coda can do most of what you want to do. And the reason you want to pick one is also just to make your analysis environment easier to manage. What my goal is to start thinking, so at the needs of requirement or assessment stage, you got to think, so I'm doing this project, you're either talking with a biologist or the PI here, or yourself, and you're saying, so this is the experiment I want to learn. So what will be my needs? And you can sort of say, okay, now this is the kind of project, given that this is what we're doing, we have this many stages, this is the sort of project I want to have SnakeMate as a workflow manager. And those choices can also be informed by the technical decisions. Okay? So that's why we sort of introducing some of these concepts to see their types, because there will be instances where one or the other has obvious advantages at the cost of maybe steeper learning curves. Okay, but once you get conversant to these tools, the stage is yours. You can do quite a lot with them. And each of them also does take some bits to learn and be conversant with. And my way of starting maybe is start small, build up. Yeah. Okay. So I've talked a bit about Git, and I'm just gonna pull another slide. So this is the paper. I'm gonna put this in our folder. This is the paper that I just referred to. You can read at your own time. We'll come back to that later. So I'm gonna. So how many of us are familiar with this term about version control? Yeah? Yeah, she's familiar with that. Anyone else? You're familiar with version control? Yeah? So a couple of us are familiar with version control. Do you want to explain just what it is? Or your understanding of version control?
On that particular project, able to get an updated
Yes, indeed. Anyone else with that? What's your understanding of version control? I've noticed working collaborations understanding the need of sharing changes. I've never happened.
So the concept, so I think we've all done this, where we've stored a file, we've created a file, and then that file, let's call it file 1, okay, for lack of a better name. And then we modify file 1 by changing a few things, and then we store it, because we don't want to lose the changes, we store it as file 1 modified. We've all done that. You'd be surprised if you know. Right? And then after a while, you want to share that file with Silvano. So I'll say file 1 modified shared with Silvanos. Okay, now I know that that's the copy that Silvanos got. And then I'll make another change. And now I'm like, what am I going to name this? File 1 modified Silvanos today. It just gets weird. At some point, you like file 2. Okay, because now you can't keep track of all those names, right? So it's that scenario, and it's something that is quite ubiquitous across computing. And you can imagine if you're managing a large software project like Linux or an operating system, it really becomes quite important to have a file manager. Okay, and traditionally we had a sort of a server that would, people would make changes, and the server would keep the copy of the modified changes, and it would work out who's making what changes. Before that, people would just exchange files and track them. So the same guy who gave us Linux 12 took that up and realized that CVN, as it was, and other systems were a bit broken. And the problem is that if you have a server sitting somewhere that is managing these files and tracking all these changes, if it gets hit by something that just knocks it off, everyone loses their changes. Okay, because what you have on your computer is separate from what I have on my computer. But when we all persist our changes to the server, then the server keeps the one and only true copy, and keeps all the track of all the files. Okay, and there was this need to create a distributed file system, version control system, that would make sure that whatever copy she has, whatever copy he has, or whatever copy I have, contains exactly the same changes. Okay, and came the idea of Git. Okay. As a distributed file system, but it's not the only one. There's Mercurial, I think, and a couple of others. Okay, and Git, as it was written initially, was quite difficult in parts. Slime installments, and but that has undergone a lot of change in the recent past. A lot of collaboration, and now people can do a much better job at distributed file systems using Git. So much so that there's an entire social enterprise called GitHub, which is a social network community where people can store their code and share them with their collaborators. And still, a company managed to make money out of it. Right? So I've sort of given a background, but then there was this slide that I think we had last year. Kind of highlighted this. Why do you want to manage different versions of the code? One, you want to have a backup system. You want to undo, you want to refer to old stuff, and so on. You want to maintain old releases while working on new releases. Okay. And this is particularly important in software. You may have a new feature, but then that feature is only important to a certain group of developers or all users. Okay, other people are quite happy with the old version, and therefore a newer version could also break old code. Okay, particularly if it's dependent on a particular distribution of a software or an operating system. Okay. Yeah, so again, we want to collaborate, work in parallel with the teammates. Yeah. So version control systems, I think I've highlighted on this, and I've talked about sort of the old systems, the revision control system, RCS, that then became, I think, superseded by concurrent version system, CVS. So if you are coding around 2000, 2003, you still will be very conversant. 2007, you still be very conversant with the CVS. And then CVN came about, Subversion, that was a game changer around 2008. Lots of people moved over to CVN. And then boom, Git came around, and lots of people migrated to Git. At some point, lots of projects were running on Subversion that requires a server system. People collaborate, make changes. You got one gatekeeper, and then that still worked, but it required a lot of resources. Whereas Git, was a much better system, keeping track of changes. And each of these, comes with a host of other services that can use to host them. Okay, essentially, you can just enable sharing version control repositories in a local area network. That still works. Internet-based systems where anyone around the world in the globe can make contributions. And you may have downloaded files from SourceForge, for example, Bitbucket, GitLab, and GitHub. The last two I think are much more familiar, GitLab and GitHub, that store and manage these file systems. Okay. So the idea behind GitHub, I don't know how many of us has a GitHub account. Yeah. A couple of us familiar with it, or have interacted with GitHub. Loads of open source software and code is actually stored in GitHub. Okay, and now GitLab. And the idea is that you get your repository running locally on your computer. You can persist all your changes in a central repository that can be a social enterprise, as is GitHub, which is a social networking site really. So is GitLab, and they leverage on the features offered by Git as a software version control system, and then they build all these other services on top of them that we all like and that enable developers to collaborate. So, as is standard, I'm gonna post a couple of links for those of us that have not interacted with these systems. Let's see what it is. I think I got a slightly longer Git again tutorial. I don't know that to go through this, or I just post them. But more important is that we got carpentries. So I'll post these so I don't know how many of us know this website, Software Carpentry. We got tons and tons of really nice tutorials, including on Docker, I think now, and many other open source tooling. And they run workshops that are just like this across the world. and they persist most of the material online, and it's amiable for self-paced learning. Okay, and rather than me take you through an entire Git tutorial, which I think will be slightly beyond the scope of this workshop, and I think it's something that you can. I'm just going to point you to some of the material, and you can sort of step through it yourselves. Okay. In particular, this tutorial, we, as you see here, you got a couple of, sorry, you got the schedule, how much time it takes to go through each of those tutorials. Just about 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 40 minutes, and it continues on and on. And ideally by a 3-hour tutorial, you'd be conversant with most of these terms. You'd be conversant with the entire system. So again, most of this will be really nice code, so we can all go through it. It's very self-paced. The instructions are very clear on how to do this. You can set up our Git repository, do the configuration to allow us to make changes, and you can just do it by yourself. So I'll post this link onto our shared Google Drive, and we can go through it, and I can walk around, or if you've got a particular issue, happy to discuss. Okay.